Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined for a fourth time by Dr. David Benatar. And today we're talking about his latest book, Very Practical Ethics, Engaging Everyday Moral Questions. So, Dr. Benatar, welcome back on the show. It's always a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
So, I mean, it's very interesting because you go through a lot of different kinds of ethical questions that people might face in their everyday lives. You talk, for example, about sex, the environment, smoking, giving aid, consumption of animal products, certain uses of language. But before we get into some of those examples, let me start by asking you some general questions. So, first of all, what is practical ethics, and how do common problems that people face differ from, for example, scenarios explored in ethics that affect maybe only a select number of people, or even thought experiments involving events that probably no one is ever going to be faced with?
Sure. Well, the area of practical ethics is much broader than I'm covering in this particular book. Practical ethics is concerned, as the name suggests, with practical ethical problems. There are other areas of ethics that look into questions, for example, about what makes a right action right or a wrong action wrong. And they will sometimes refer to examples. And as you note, sometimes those examples are going to be highly theorized and theoretical ones, hypothetical ones. But the area of practical ethics is really interested in what we ought practically to do. But it does include questions that go beyond what I look at in this book, because what I'm interested in are what I'm calling very practical ethical questions, or to use a term that I've used elsewhere, quotidian ethical problems. These are problems that confront ordinary people in their everyday lives. So if you think about the question of abortion or capital punishment, these are practical ethical questions, but they're not quotidian problems. They're not problems that an individual is going to face in their everyday life. Hopefully, questions about abortion will be relatively rare in any individual's life and perhaps absent in many other people's lives. Questions about the moral justifiability of capital punishment, these are questions that the state really needs to engage. These are not questions that people are going to be confronting in their ordinary life. And similarly, they're going to be questions about professional ethics, ethical questions that arise within particular roles, public roles, and that falls beyond the scope of what I'm looking at here. I'm interested in these quotidian ethical questions in this book.
And do you approach the ethical problems you deal with in the book from the point of view of any specific ethical theory, like, for example, consequentialism, deontology, or virtue ethics?
No, in fact, I specifically try to bracket the disagreements there are between those different theoretical positions, because my worry is that if I adopt a particular theoretical view, and then I spell out what the implications of that would be for the practical issues, that this will then not be of interest to people who don't accept the background theoretical view. So I try to engage the practical issues in their own terms. Sometimes it will make a difference what your background theory is, and then I might point to those differences. But in general, I'm not wanting to assume a particular ethical theory.
And what do right and wrong mean in the context of practical ethics?
Well, that's one of the questions that I look at in the introduction to the book. And I point out that those terms like right and wrong are actually multiply ambiguous. They can mean different things. So the word right could mean, for example, something that is required, an action that is morally required, or it could mean simply an action that is morally permissible, so not required and not prohibited. But it might also mean an action that has some kind of moral value without being morally required. So if you say it's the right thing to do, it's not that you're technically required to do it, but you get moral credit for doing it. And then there's also the abstract noun version of right, that is a right to not be killed, for example. And so these are very ambiguous terms. And one of the things I try to do in the introduction is to disambiguate them and get some clarity.
So one more general question before we get into a specific example you explore in the book. So How does ethics differ from norms in a particular society?
Well, norms in a particular society are social perceptions about what you ought to do. And some of those norms may be perceived to be moral norms, but they needn't always be. So sometimes a society might just think that certain things are not to be done, but not that they are morally wrong. It's just that they would, let's say, violate etiquette or good manners in a given society. But it is true, as I've suggested, that sometimes a society has a perception of what is right or wrong and will then have an according norm. But societies can be wrong in their judgments, just as individuals can be wrong in their judgments about what norms ought to prevail. And so, what the philosopher tries to do is to step back from perceptions about what we ought to do to see what we've got best reason for thinking we ought to do.
So one of the topics, as I mentioned in the beginning, that you include in your book has to do with sex. So, and you explore different views. I think we could call them ethical views of sex, and a pair of them are the significance view and the casual view of sex. Could you explain them, and do you prefer one over the other?
Well, it's interesting because the chapter on sex is the chapter in which I give least direction because I'm actually ultimately agnostic on which these two views we ought to take. So, to
Mm,
sketch them briefly, the significance view suggests that in order for sex to be morally permissible, it must be the expression of mutual romantic love.
mm,
And the casual view would deny that. The casual view of sex is that sex is just like any other activity that is prone to cause pleasure, and it doesn't have any special requirements, just as you can eat a meal or enjoy an art exhibition together with somebody who you don't have a deep affection towards. So you could have sex with somebody permissibly without having mutual romantic love. And I think at the outset, many people will be immediately inclined to one or other of these views. And one of the things I try to spell out in the chapter is that there's actually bad news for both of these views, that the full set of views that any one individual holds about sexual practices, an array of sexual practices, is unlikely to fit with any one of these views. So something is going to have to be given up. And so I present really a kind of dilemma. There is a fallback position that I refer to. It's not the direct topic of most of my discussion in that chapter, but I do refer to it, and that is the view that perhaps the significance view is a view not about what sex is permissible, but a view about what sex is morally best. So it's not
okay.
that it would be impermissible to have sex with somebody for whom you did not have, with whom you did not have mutual romantic love, but it might just be less morally desirable. That's another possible position.
Mhm. So let's perhaps you explore several different examples of sexual activities in the book. Let's perhaps pick one of them and talk about it. When it comes to rape specifically, on what grounds can it be morally condemned?
Well, this is a case where both the advocates of the significance view and the casual view can condemn rape. Both of them can do that. But it's only the significance view that can show that there's a special wrong with rape, because there are going to be lots of activities where you force somebody to do something, and the casual view can say, well, it's wrong. You can force somebody to eat some food, for example, or you can force them to go to the opera with you, and that would be wrong to do. And the advocate of the casual view would similarly be able to say that forcing somebody to have sex would be morally wrong, and it might even be pretty seriously morally wrong, but it wouldn't be more wrong on the casual view than would forcing somebody to eat something, for example. And that is going to strike many people as odd. The way to avoid that implication is really by going for the significance view, because the significance view is wanting to set sex apart from these other activities that are prone to cause pleasure. And I'm quite specific in saying prone to cause. It's not that they have to cause pleasure in every individual instance. And so the significance view can very easily say why there's a special wrong in rape. There's going to be a much bigger challenge for the advocate of the casual view to show why that's the case.
So, is there anything that could be wrong about masturbation specifically?
Well, again, I think this is a case where it depends on how exactly you're going to understand the significance view. On the casual view, obviously, there's nothing wrong, and advocates of the casual view are going to say that that's absolutely fine, that's entirely intuitive. I think advocates of the significance view could go in different ways. So one thing you can say is, well, there's no mutuality in this sexual activity, so assuming you're using the term masturbation to refer to what somebody does to themselves as opposed to perhaps a mutual masturbation. And so you may say, well, there's no mutuality here, and so it's failing to meet the requirements of the significance view, and therefore it's either impermissible or at the very least morally less good. But another possibility is to say, well, because it only involves one individual, there are no two individuals here, and so the mutuality requirement would fall away. And so the significance view simply wouldn't apply there, and then it might be permissible on that view. So I can see different ways in which a significance theorist would approach that particular question.
And then you also explore another pair of views. There are the reproductive and the anti-reproductive views of sex. Could you tell us about them?
Yes, a very common view, often held among conservatives, is that for sex to be morally permissible, it must stand the chance of being reproductive. That is to say, it must stand the chance of producing offspring. And some conservatives want to use this, for example, to rule out homosexual sex, which they say has no option of being reproductive, no opportunity to be reproductive. Would also apply to bestiality, to sex with a child who's not gone through puberty. So they could say it could rule out all of these activities. But they do face a problem because it seems to also rule out sex between married people who are for some reason infertile. So if a woman is postmenopausal, she and her husband might not be able to have permissible sex on this view. Sometimes advocates of the significance view want to contort themselves in a way to say, well, this is between an adult male and a female, and so in principle it could be reproductive, but that seems like a highly strained rationalization of their view. So it's going to have that kind of odd implication. Now, of course, there are many people who reject the reproductive view, say sex does not need to be reproductive, and I think that's an entirely plausible position. My own view, for reasons we've discussed in an earlier interview, is that actually sex should not be reproductive. So I have the anti-reproductive view because I'm an anti-natalist and think that it's wrong to bring new sentient beings into existence. I think sex is going to be fine if it's not reproductive. I mean, there are other conditions as well that you might apply, including possibly the significance view. But certainly a requirement for permissible sex, on my view, is that it would not be reproductive.
So anti-natalism is part of this set of ethical questions surrounding sexual practices, right?
Correct. I think so. But I do acknowledge that my views on this are controversial. And so, this is not a tract on anti-natalism. So I draw attention to what anti-natalists would say about this, but I also allow the scope that somebody might reject that particular view and then assemble a collection of other views about sexual ethics in order to generate a practical ethical conclusion.
Mm-hmm. So before we move on to another topic, let me just ask you, do you think that it is possible from any of the views we explored here, the reproductive, anti-reproductive, significance, casual view, or even a combination of them, to justify that all incest is wrong?
That's hard to do. I mean, on the casual view, there's no way of saying why incest will be wrong. And on the significance view, of course, it's possible for, let's say, adult siblings to have mutual romantic love. And if they're of the opposite sex, then their sex could be reproductive. But there is this challenge in that sex between closely related people, if it is reproductive, is much more likely to lead to abnormalities in the offspring. And that would then, of course, harm those offspring. And so it may be that on those grounds, you would say that the reproductive incestuous sex is wrong, but it can't be on the grounds of it being incestuous per se, because that's going to meet the significance requirement. It would be because it actually causes harm that it would be wrong.
Mhm. So now I would like to ask you a little bit about questions surrounding the environment. So when it comes to the environment, what ethical questions or some examples of ethical questions that fall under the rubric of practical ethics? Could you tell us about some of that?
Well, for a very long time, there have been questions about local pollution. So one could pollute one's environment locally by littering, for example, and polluting the local water. And those are going to be practical ethical questions. But in recent decades, a much more catastrophic issue, in a sense, is the global environment and our contribution to the global environment. So if you think about carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions that we individuals engage in, these contribute in aggregation to potentially catastrophic effects from environmental change. And so that does raise a question. But it's an interesting question because the emissions of no individual are going to cause these harms. It's these emissions in aggregation with others. And this leads to a very interesting ethical problem that actually recurs in a number of other chapters in the book. It's the problem of what's known as causal inefficacy or sometimes inconsequentialism. And this is really about the question, does it make any difference whether or not I engage in this activity? Because if I do, barely any difference of a negative kind will result. And if I don't, there'll be barely any benefit. But if everybody reasons that way, then we've got a real problem.
Right, but with that in mind, do you think that even if the vast majority of individuals are not doing what they can to reduce emissions, for example, should I, as an individual, still have a duty to do it myself?
Well, I argue that there is a duty, but that it's a limited duty. So I'm steering a path between those people who say, because of this problem of inconsequentialism, there's absolutely no duty at all. And those people who think that we have very, very substantial duties with regard to our individual actions. I think that neither of those positions are plausible. My worry with the first position is that if we say people have no duty whatsoever, well, then that is very likely just to exacerbate the problem because everybody will then just emit with abandon. But on the other hand, to require some individual to stop emitting at fairly high levels, when that comes at quite significant cost to them, and yet doesn't secure any meaningful good, it's also hard to say that that person is required to do that. And so I think our primary duties are really to support a collective action that would result in lowering emissions. So that's where our strongest duties lie. But we also have some duties, I think, to consider the contribution that we make to global warming and to try to limit that. So it's not that you have to limit it to zero net emissions, but you need to do what you can within reason to limit your contribution.
Okay, so let me ask you about an activity that many people out there participate in. Do you think that in order to reduce emissions, we should be morally obliged to stop driving?
Well, again, I don't think so because sometimes there are very important benefits to be derived from driving. Some people, for example, can't get to work without driving. If they go to work, they're able to earn a salary which can support them and their family. They can also contribute to aid, the subject of another chapter.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one's going to be hard pressed to say that all of those things must be given up because you shouldn't be driving. But I do think it's going to have an impact on how much driving you do. So it should impact on decisions, it should be relevant to decisions, for example, to how close to your work you live. It should be relevant to question about joy rides. I mean, even joy rides are going to make relatively little contribution, but you can have fewer of them rather than more of them. And so I think we should do what we can to limit those. But it's a constant balancing between the amount of sacrifice that you're making and the amount of harm that you're preventing, but also recognizing that you are one of many, many people making that kind of decision. And so you can't just view it as an individual decision. You have to recognize it as a decision that you and others are making.
Mm-hmm. So to establish here a small link, I think, between the previous topic, sex, and the environment, and going back to the topic of anti-natalism, I guess, how bad is procreation for the environment?
Well, it's pretty bad. One of the things I point out in the book is that one of the biggest contributions you can make to global warming is just by having a child. And I do the mathematics and show how recycling has a relatively small impact, and your driving has a greater impact, and your flying has a greater impact. But more than all of these things is having a child. Because having a child, certainly in the developed world where average emission rates are really high, is going to lead to a significant environmental impact. Now, I also look at details about whether you're sharing this cost, as it were, with your procreative partner. But even when you take that into account, this is perhaps the highest emission activity that you can engage in. Now, does this tell you per se that procreation is wrong? No, I don't think it does. I don't think that this is a definitive argument against procreation. It's probably an argument for reproducing less than you otherwise would. But the arguments I advanced in the earlier books, most especially Better Never to Have Been, those are arguments that I think produce a categorical injunction against procreating. And so the interesting thing is when you combine that argument with the environmental argument, then you get a somewhat overdetermined argument against procreation. It's not that the environmental argument by itself will do the work, but it certainly bolsters up the anti-natalist argument that I advanced in earlier books.
Mm-hmm. So I would like to ask you now a little bit about smoking. I mean, this is a topic that here in Portugal, for example, has been very relevant in recent years because there have been restrictions enacted on it in particular places. And I would like to ask you, are there ethical questions associated with smoking? Are the ethical questions associated with smoking just about the harm it can cause to non-smokers, or are there also ethical questions to consider in regarding to the act of smoking alone and the potential harms to the smoker?
Thank you. Yes, in the chapter, I do start out by looking at ethical questions that arise from the harm that smoking does to the individual who is smoking. And there are some ethical views that would deny that that's relevant. In other words, some people think that ethics is really just about what you do to other people.
Mm-hmm.
And I reject that view. It may be that some of the more important ethical issues are of that kind, but I do think that if we understand ethics as how you ought to live, then there can be questions about purely self-regarding actions that affect only yourself, that fall within the scope of ethics. And my suggestion here is that if you're not already a smoker, then you ought not to become a smoker, because this is a dangerous activity to yourself and to others. It's also an expensive activity, and it's an addictive activity. It's not as though you can readily revisit this decision later once you've become addicted. And so I think there are very good reasons not to start smoking. But I also exhibit an awareness of what it's like for a smoker, somebody who's already smoking. And I certainly can imagine circumstances in which somebody who's already a smoker may be under no obligation to give it up based on the effect on themselves. But there would still be questions about the effect of their smoking on other people.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes smokers who are not fond of restrictions evoke examples of other activities that most people participate in, like driving, that they say are even more harmful to humans and the environment, but no one cares about restricting them. Do they have a point here?
I don't think so. And the driving analogy is one that I looked at in this chapter, or more specifically in an appendix to the chapter. I'm afraid my empirical inquiries here have not yielded a definitive answer on whether driving, the collective effects of driving, are worse than the collective effects of smoking. It's because it's really hard to get comparative data and hard to know what the appropriate denominator is sometimes in these comparisons. But even if we set that aside, driving has a benefit very often, not always, but very often, that smoking doesn't have. And so to ask people not to smoke in the presence of non-smokers is not like asking somebody not to drive. Not to drive can involve a much greater sacrifice for people. That's not to say that there are going to be no restrictions on how we may drive and what kind of engines we should have and what kind of petroleum or gas should be used in the running of those cars. All of those questions are still entirely pertinent. But I don't think that appealing to the acceptability of car driving or the widespread acceptability of car driving as a basis for condoning cigarette smoking is a plausible argument.
And by the way, how about electronic cigarettes? Are they any better than regular cigarettes at this point? What do we know about their potential harms?
Again, my empirical investigation there suggests that we don't yet have all the data that we need to make comparisons, in part because electronic cigarettes have just not been around for as long as tobacco cigarettes have been. And also there are lots of variations between different forms of smoking. So that's hard to know. But again, I would encourage people not to start smoking if they're not already smokers, because there seems to be very little, in fact, nothing to be gained and lots to be lost from starting off with e-cigarettes. And then again, probably best not to smoke those kinds of cigarettes in the presence of non-smokers, if for no other reason than just out of caution. But there is some evidence as well that this might be harmful to others.
So, shifting gears to giving aid, which is another topic you explore in the book. First of all, how do we identify people who need aid and the ones that should be the recipients of it?
Well, that's a really hard question, but perhaps a harder question still is, of all the people who need aid, who should we be helping? Because the need probably outstrips the resources, certainly is going to outstrip the resources of any individual. And so you need to decide how best to allocate your resources. And that's a practical question that really varies from moment to moment. I can't give any guidance here, either in the book or now, that would be enduring. And many of these charity guidance organizations like Give Well are well known for varying their recommendations. So at a given time, they'll make one recommendation, and at another time, they'll make another recommendation because the relevant facts might change. For example, if they recommend aid to a particular organization, there may be a burst of aid to that organization, and then that organization has got more for the moment than it can actually process. And so it may then make more sense to divert some resources to another organization. And so I don't think that highly specific advice can be given here, but there's no shortage of people who are in dire need. People and animals, by the way, who are suffering unbearably and could benefit from assistance.
And how do we determine to what point we should be morally obliged to give aid to someone, and when does it become too demanding?
Well, this is a very deep question in ethics more generally, even if we move beyond practical ethics. And I do, through these practical ethical issues, try to formulate a view about this. And again, I opt for something of a middle path between two kinds of extreme views. I don't always think middle paths are the correct paths, but in this case, among some others, I think that the very, very demanding views that people like Peter Singer have advanced, I think, are implausible. But so too are the views that we have no duties to positively aid people who are in need. I think there is some kind of intermediate position, and I think the intermediate position is the most reasonable one, and that's the reason why we should settle upon it. And I go into quite some detail in the book trying to gauge what that might be, where that middle path might lie.
By the
It
way,
might not be a strict middle.
Could you just tell us about Peter Singer's position and why you think it is implausible?
Well, it's hard to summarize my responses in a short space of time. I go into quite a lot of detail in the book, trying to imagine various interpretations of what he's saying and then considering various objections to it. But his view is really, it rests on a principle. And the principle is that if you can prevent something very bad from happening without sacrificing anything of comparable moral significance, then you ought to do it. And the example that he often uses to illustrate this or to generate the principle, there's some dispute about what exactly he's doing there, is the case of a child drowning in a pond. You're going to work and you see this child drowning in a pond, and you could save the child, but that would involve wading into the pond, damaging your fairly expensive shoes and making the bottom of your pants wet, and have you arrive at work a little late. And most people would reach the conclusion that it would be morally indecent, morally wrong, if you were to just walk by the child and allow the child to die. What you ought to do is step in, because you are, in this case, preventing something very bad from happening, and it comes only at the cost of something that is not of comparable moral significance. And that seems perfectly reasonable in the single case. But the worry is that if you aggregate that over all the possible instances that you could save somebody through charitable donations, then you reach his conclusion that you ought to give away most of what you have. And indeed, beyond that, in fact, even choose your profession based on what can generate the most resources. So perhaps you shouldn't be a podcaster. Perhaps you should work in a higher paying profession, like dentistry, for example, and then you could generate more resources in order to feed the world's poor. And my view is that this really amounts to a kind of voluntary self-enslavement, because if you now need to do the kind of work that you don't want to do, that you don't get fulfillment from doing, and you have to do something else, then that's like a kind of enslavement, and that's a pretty significant cost. It may not be comparable, but it's nonetheless pretty significant. And I think it's unreasonable to ask that of individuals, especially when you're not responsible for having caused all of these problems. If you'd caused somebody's absolute poverty, then I think you'd have very robust duties to bail them out of that. But if this is a result of multiple other causes, including, by the way, their parents producing them, then it's not clear to me that the extent of your duty is anything like as serious as he suggests.
When it comes specifically to our consumption of meat and other animal products, how much suffering and death are we causing per year? I mean, what numbers are we talking about?
Billions of animals. In fact, probably billions of animals every day. If you just think about how many fish are drawn, tiny fish are drawn out of the ocean, bigger fish as well, the number of chickens that are killed, cows, sheep, goats, pigs. There are 8 billion people on the planet, and the vast majority of those eat animals. We're causing a vast amount of death and suffering. And this has really been exacerbated by the increase in the number of intensive farms, factory farms, where animals suffer even more than they would ordinarily.
And how do we determine if some of this suffering, and I mean, by this suffering, I'm not only limiting it to the suffering of non-human animals, but also humans, like, for example, extreme poverty and other things that we talked about when we were talking about giving aid. I mean, how do we determine if some of this suffering is justified?
Well, it's hard. On what basis would you think that any of this suffering is justified?
I mean, I don't know, perhaps because some people would argue that we get some benefit from it, or more other people get some benefit from it.
Well, let's separate out, I think, the famine style cases, the absolute poverty cases from the animal cases.
Okay.
Vast majority of people on Earth do not need to eat animals or animal products in order to lead healthy lives, and in fact would probably lead healthier lives without consuming those products. Now, that's not true for every last human being, but it's also not true for every last human being that failing to eat human beings is unnecessary, because there are going to be circumstances where cannibalism may be necessary to save somebody's life, but that's not ordinarily true, and so it's not a case for ordinarily consuming human flesh. And ditto, there may be some circumstances in which you need to eat animal flesh in order to survive, but that's not true in most cases.
Mhm. So, but do you think that when it comes to using animal products or using animals themselves, like for example, not eating them, but in testing new drugs, that a case like that is morally justified or not?
Well, first of all, animal experimentation falls, I think, outside of the purview of this particular book, because this is
Hmm.
now no longer
Okay,
a quotidian ethical issue. It's an issue in scientific ethics or bioethics more generally.
right.
And there are lots of questions there. Uh, it's a much more complicated story precisely because people think that something more important is at stake than is at stake, if you'll excuse that expression, when people are eating steaks.
Yeah.
But there are lots of problems. I mean, first of all, animals are not the best models for human disease, precisely because they're a different species. The
Mhm.
best models for human disease are going to be humans. And a lot of people want to say, well, but humans may not be experimented on. And a lot of animal rights advocates are going to say, yeah, and animals may also not be experimented on. So if you're justifying this on the basis of a utilitarian calculus, you're saying that sacrificing some small number could produce a great amount of good. It may well be that by sacrificing a small number of human beings, you'd actually produce more good because you'll have a much more reliable model for what you're testing. If you're not willing to follow through with the argument in the case of humans, then it suggests that you're not merely doing a utilitarian calculation. There's something else that's going on when you invoke that argument to justify animal experimentation, non-human animal experimentation. So there are lots of issues there, which I suppose we shouldn't really enter into now, because they do indeed go beyond the domain of quotidian ethics.
Right. So I would like to get now a little bit into the domain of language and certain uses of language. So are there instances where it can be immoral to utter or write certain words or expressions?
Well, I do distinguish, as many philosophers do, between using and mentioning a word.
Okay.
And I think that very often using certain words is going to be wrong, because certain words are intended as insults.
Mhm.
And unless you've got good reason for insulting somebody, you shouldn't be doing it. I'm not saying insulting somebody is never justified, but it's typically not going to be justified on the basis, let's say, of somebody's race or their sex or their sexual orientation. Those kind of slurs or insults, very hard to see how they could be justified. And so I think that those are going to be wrong. But what many people don't do is they don't recognize the distinction between using a slur, for example, and mentioning it. When you mention a slur, you're not using it. You're not directing a slur at somebody. there's a sense in which you're really referring to it. And I think the mistake that people make here is they attribute a kind of magical power to either the auditory sounds or to the scratchings that make up a word. They think that merely uttering it, merely making that sound, or merely making those scratchings by writing the word has a kind of magical power that can be harmful, and therefore one ought not to do that. And that to me is just ridiculous. That is magical thinking. That is no different, let's say, from people who want to invoke blasphemy laws and say, well, merely mentioning the name of God, for example, in the wrong context amounts to blasphemy. And I do in the book refer to that wonderful scene in Monty Python's The Life of Brian, where there's a character who's being stoned for blaspheming. And this very quickly becomes meta. And when his action is described, the person who's overseeing the stoning is now mentioning the name of God rather than using it in a blasphemous way, and then he gets stoned. And we can all look on this and laugh at it, but I think a lot of people are not going to recognize that the very same dynamic is at work, the very same mistake is at work in the mention of other words today, not typically the name of God, but other words.
Mm-hmm. What about talking about today? How about preferred pronouns? Do you think that people who use non-conventional pronouns can demand that other people use them? And if so, would that make intentionally using the incorrect pronoun something immoral or not?
Well, I do look into this in quite some detail and with quite some nuance. I do think that there's a general, although defeasible principle that we ought to refer to people the way they would like to be referred to. So if somebody has a preference for a particular pronoun, I think that there is a defeasible presumption in favor of doing that. But there may be circumstances where you're not morally obliged. I mean, let's imagine somebody is changing their pronouns every second day, and let's imagine the pronouns they're choosing are highly unusual ones, sort of weird constructs of their own making, and it's really hard, especially for people who struggle even to remember people's names, to now remember these pronouns as well. The suggestion that you might now be required, morally required under these circumstances, might be just asking too much of people. So I can imagine circumstances where you wouldn't be obliged to do that. But the general presumption, I think, is refer to people the way they would like to be referred to.
Mm-hmm. So I would like to ask you now about some debates that have been occurring surrounding the limits of humor. So in what ways could humor raise moral questions? Are there specific kinds of humor that should be considered immoral? And why should we even care about the ethics of humor?
Good. Well, I think there are two possible grounds on which we could find fault with humor. The one is if the humor is an expression of some defect in the agent. And by the agent, I mean either the person who's telling the joke or offering the humor, or the person who is appreciating it. So that's one, is a defect in the agent. The other is some adverse consequence, an unjustified adverse consequence that results from some humor. So let me give you examples of each of them. I mean, let's imagine you have somebody who is deeply prejudiced, let's say about a particular racial group, and they now start telling jokes about that racial group. And other people around them are appreciating those jokes precisely because they share those prejudices. Well, now we can find fault with that humor because it is an expression of the prejudice. But the very same jokes might not be an expression of prejudice in the mouths of other people or in the heads of other people. Other people might enjoy those same jokes for another reason. And then I think we would be justified in not finding fault with their appreciation or their utterance of the jokes. If we look at the consequences, you can imagine a highly combustible environment imagine it's, let's say, a meeting of the Ku Klux Klan, and they're telling anti-African American jokes. This could fuel up the people who are gathered around, and they could go out and they could perpetrate some real wrongful harm. And I think we would have a very different, and should have a very different attitude to the telling of a joke in that context than, let's say, if Dave Chappelle, the African American comedian, is telling the same joke or offering the same kind of humor to a relatively enlightened audience, where we are not going to expect and shouldn't reasonably expect a consequence of that kind to result. So my sense is, generally we need to be highly context sensitive in our evaluation of humor.
But just by someone getting offended by a particular joke, does that make it morally problematic?
No, I don't think so, because I think people can be hypersensitive. They can be misguided. And we're not obliged just to defer to any inappropriate and wrongful perception of something. Now, it's not that it may not factor in. It may be that if you know somebody gets offended by a particular kind of joke, you should just rather not tell it to them if they're the intended audience for your joke. But let's imagine you're broadcasting a joke over a public broadcaster, and you know that there are lots of people who are going to appreciate it. The mere fact that there's an individual or some small number of individuals out there who will take offense at it, that by itself is not a definitive indication that you should not tell the joke.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you then just one last question. We've talked about some of these related to some pairs of topics that you explore in the book, but do you think that there are any common threads that run through all the ethical issues you explore in your book?
I'm not sure about all, but there's certainly threads that run through a number of topics. So, for example, the question about causal inefficacy that I mentioned earlier, that arises in the environmental case, as we discussed. It also arises in the case of eating meat, because if you go into a supermarket and you purchased a steak, let's say, it's not clear that that by itself is going to result in increased demand for steaks and lead to the suffering of any further animals. And so the question arises there. It also arises in an array of other topics. So smoking, for example, if you smoke in the presence of a non-smoker, the ill effect that that's going to have on the non-smoker is negligible. It's a very minor increase in risk. But obviously, if this is aggregated across many smokers, then you're going to have much higher increased levels of risk for the non-smokers. And so one of the things that I do in the conclusion is look at that problem of causal inefficacy. I point out not only the similarities of how it arises in these different cases, but also differences between them. And there are quite crucial differences between them that I think should lead us to evaluate these different cases in different ways. So, for example, in the environmental case, the harm arises through an aggregation of harmless activities. Whereas in the animal case, the harm gets obscured by an aggregation of individual cases. If you had to kill a cow in order to eat it, the connection between the eating and the killing would be very obvious. It's when you have an aggregation of meat eating and the outsourcing, as it were, of the killing and butchering and preparation of the meat, that the harm that you do now gets obscured through the aggregation of multiple activities. And I think that is a relevant difference to what we should, in fact, do in practice. I think it suggests we should not be eating animals ever. I mean, well, almost ever. I mean, there may be there's highly exceptional cases, but we should generally not be eating animals. Whereas it's permissible to engage in some carbon emitting practices, because that is in itself harmless. It's when it aggregates that it becomes problematic.
Mm-hmm. So the book is again very practical ethics, engaging everyday moral questions. I'm leaving a link to it in the description of the interview. And Dr. Benatar, just before we go, are there any particular places on the internet where people can find your work?
None that I control. So I'm afraid I'm not very much online. So
Okay.
people just have to look. But thank you.
Okay, fair enough. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show again. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure to speak with you.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingboard, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.